Hey everybody, this is Jeremy Siskind. I'm the author of a bunch of books, but I want to celebrate this book, Jazz Piano Fundamentals, Book 3, which is available now, everywhere, anywhere you could think about buying a book. It's going to be there. It's going to be right there. And I want to show you a bit of the portion where we're talking about cluster voicings and quartal voicings. Now, this is kind of interesting. So in most jazz piano, we think about kind of avoiding having too many thirds in a row. And this is one of those things that is and isn't true simultaneously, right? It's like when they say, don't begin a sentence with the word because. Like, we tell people to avoid it because people make stupid errors when they do that. But in reality, you can start sentences with the word because. All right, what am I talking about? So let's just kind of talk about thirds for a second. So in jazz, we generally say, don't use a stack of thirds, because then what you get is, often like these really basic sounding voicings. You're not going to get hired from gigs if you're playing chords like this. Right? I'm just stacking up 1, 3, 5, 7. Okay. But thirds can be cool if they're played in a different register and not starting on the root or the third. So like, if I'm doing a modal solo or a modal accompanying and going, so I am playing just thirds. Or maybe even more interesting, like if I were playing like a triad here and then, not there, like a triad there as well. This is mostly thirds. Right? I could kind of imagine, oddly, Bill Evans and or Gil Evans using textures like that. But in general, a lot of jazz voicings are formed around this idea that we don't want to just stack thirds. We want things to be more rounded, okay? And that's where cluster and quartal voicings come in. So I would define cluster voicings as a voicing made up primarily of seconds, okay? And when we talk about modal voicings, we're talking about making voicings within a mode. So we're not talking about specifically major seconds or minor seconds. It really depends where we are in the scale. Okay, so, for example, if we're in the D Dorian mode, we're going to be using all white keys to create these cluster voicings, right? Right, but if we're in B flat mixolydian, we're going to be using the E flat major scale, or B flat major scale plus an A flat to make these cluster voicings. Now you could hear in that scale that those first few voicings are a little bit low, and seconds are one of those intervals where, if we play them too low, they start sounding muddy. So range is definitely a factor, and these are going to sound best probably within, this medium range. Now with cluster voicings, the other definition of voicing is a big deal, right? The other definition of voicing is bringing out a note within the chord. If we play these cluster voicings kind of all the same, they sound a little bit like garbage. But if we're able to bring out one note, usually the top note, that's going to be the most common thing. It brings everything into focus, and you can get away with playing a bigger cluster voicing. And it can really be very impressionistic, right? I'm playing every note in D minor. cluster voicing is I'd say a looser word, right? Meaning that the cluster voicing has to be mainly made up of seconds. So we don't need every single second to be filled in to call it a cluster voicing. We're adults, we can use words however we want. A really logical place, to use to separate would be between the top note and the next note, because that's going to help make that melody even clearer and more intentional. So instead of having, we could have a 4-note cluster voicing like this, in which all 4 of these notes are filled in. You can see on the keyboard in the middle, right? But we could also move the bottom 3 down, and have a cluster down there, but a separate melody. And this is kind of fun because you might be able to see that I'm playing the top note with my right hand and the rest of the cluster with my left, which makes it really easy to bring out that top note. I could make 5-note clusters. Really, seriously, that top note being louder makes all the difference. If you wanted to practice these cluster voicings, then I would kind of do what I'm suggesting here in the book, which is to practice scales with 3 total notes arranged in seconds, 4 total notes arranged in seconds, 5 total notes arranged in seconds. So in D Dorian, to give you an example, I hope your head's not spinning from all these scene changes, but practice. I'll do it in both hands. Right? Or B flat mixolydian. Right? And the more notes you add, the more difficult it gets. That's pretty easy for my right hand, pretty tricky for my left hand. It's like they tell you to practice your scales and you're like, well, I'm done. I've got all my major scales. No, can you play them with notes draped in seconds underneath? This is how well we need to know our scales as jazz musicians. Okay, so cluster voicings are voicings mainly made up of seconds. Quartal voicings are famously voicings principally made up of fourths. And I would say that the 3-note quartal voicing is probably the most common thing that happens in the left hand of a jazz pianist for kind of modal and modern music. There's a lot of other stuff, don't get me wrong, but if I had to choose one thing that you mainly hear people doing, it's this 3-note quartal voicing. And it's also worth noting that quartal voicings are the bottom part of a so what voicing. So just like we could play our scales below the Dorian mode with cluster voicings, we could play these 3-note quartal voicings with all the notes arranged in fourths. Now, the number one confusion that happens with quartal voicings is that people want to make all perfect fourths. And that's cool, but that's not going to get you all the voicings within a mode. So instead, you have to sometimes have perfect fourths and sometimes have augmented fourths based on the positioning within the mode. So for instance, right, this first voicing that's below the note D has all perfect fourths, but the next one beneath the note E has a perfect fourth and then an augmented fourth or a tritone. Then all perfect fourths, all perfect fourths, all perfect fourths. You could hear now it's got that tritone again. Okay, or in B flat mixolydian. Now, some people say, well, some of those sound bad. And as we stack up more fourths, it's going to be even more of an issue. And in my opinion, all of these are usable, but they're not all equal. Here's what I mean by that. Some of them are going to be used more often and used more as a stable sound. For instance, we love hearing the third in jazz. So for me, this one, with this F on bottom, that's going to be probably my go-to. This next one actually has both the third and the seventh if we're in D Dorian. So that's going to be a pretty nice one to hang out on too. Whereas maybe, this one, which has these really dissonant intervals, I'm going to slide off of that one more often. So I do encourage my students to learn all 7 voicings, but then don't think that just because you've learned all of them that they can be treated exactly equally. But as I'm comping with these, I'm going to move through them. So check it out. And so what I'm doing is I'm using this one based on the third kind of as my home base. And I'm thinking about going away from that and then returning back to it. And that's one element of tension and release that I'm creating. Is like, this is the one to me that feels like I've got that chord defined. And then some of these others are wishy-washy. And then I come back to that main one. And oftentimes I'm coming back to it at the beginning of, for instance, 4-measure phrases or 8-measure phrases. So it's one way I'm creating this stable point, tension without leaving the mode, and then back to the stable point. Tension is not leaving the mode or playing out, but then coming back to the stable point. I think that's really important. Now, we can build bigger quartal voicings, 4-note, 5-note, and even 6-note. And you're going to hear that these get more and more dissonant, right? 6-note. The word pointy always comes to mind. It's kind of like somebody's poking you with their finger really hard as you get to 6-note quartal voicings. But these are great for comping with a band. It's that real McCoy Tyner Coltrane Quartet intense sound that you can get potentially with those voicings. Okay, now last thing before this video gets too long is that we can think about combining these two practices of quartal and cluster to a certain degree, which is that, if we want to play something quartal in the left hand but have it be thicker, we can condense a larger quartal voicing into a single octave. So for instance, we've got this quartal voicing built up from the third, and I can bring that A down as I'm showing you in that first example in the upper left-hand corner, and get this 4-note voicing, which is a very typical AB voicing actually for a minor 6 chord. Or we could stack the quartal voicing up from the 7th and get this crunchier voicing because we've got that nice half step between the B and the C. We could think about taking a 5-note voicing. Again, I'm stacking up from the third. Now I'm on the bottom line here. Or to stack it up from the bottom, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, as we get into 5 notes, they're almost starting to sound like cluster voicings, right? Because we're getting a lot of seconds in the middle there. So these, even though seconds and fourths are so different, as we start making bigger voicings and stuffing them into an octave, the two concepts come together. Okay, so let's do a review. First thing, this was all from my book, and it goes way more into depth, and there's a lot of practice in here. This is Jazz Piano Fundamentals, Book 3, Modal and Modern. Best on the market, says me. Unbiased opinion. So remember, thirds we generally avoid. We don't want to use them the wrong way, which is just stacking up a chord in the lower register. That's really kind of yucky and annoying. But there are some ways that we could use parallel thirds tastefully. Second thing, cluster voicings can be built beneath a melody note. We want to really make sure to push out that melody note to make it louder than the rest, to make that voicing focused. And that's going to be a big difference. Cluster voicings could be just a complete stack of seconds, or it could be mostly seconds and a couple of other things in there. And then thirdly, quartal voicings are an essential part of the modal jazz comping vocabulary. Remember that you want to use perfect fourths and augmented fourths. And then, if you want to put a bigger quartal voicing within a single octave, lower or raise some notes so that you kind of focus them into a single hand position. I started this video with a little non sequitur about the word because. Let's use that as our catchphrase for the day. If you've watched all the way to the end, use the word because. And thanks for watching, everybody.